The better bargain. Those 3 words hit Bessie Wells like the flat of a hand across the face, and she stood in the middle of Aaron Carson's kitchen with dust still on her boots and a carpetbag hanging from her white-knuckled fist, staring at the man who had just said them without a single flicker of apology in his dark eyes. "I beg your pardon," she said, and her voice was quieter than she intended, quieter than the fury building behind her ribs. Aaron Carson did not step back. He was a tall man, wide in the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that came from years under a merciless Nevada sun, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he has already decided is sound before he has even checked its teeth. "I said," he repeated slowly, as though she had not heard him the first time, "that you are the better bargain. Clara Finch was the one I corresponded with. She had a ranch background, knew livestock, could ride. The agency sent you instead. You are not what I arranged for, Miss Wells, but you are here and the season does not wait, and so I am willing to make the best of it. The better bargain, not a woman. Not a person who had sold almost everything she owned to afford the train ticket from Missouri. Not someone who had swallowed every doubt she had ever harbored about answering a mail-order advertisement and climbed onto that westbound train with her heart hammering in her chest. Just a bargain, a transaction, a replacement part slotted into a machine that barely registered the substitution. Bessie set her carpetbag down on the floor with a deliberate thud. "I want you to understand something, Mr. Carson," she said, meeting those dark eyes without blinking. "I did not come out here to be tolerated. And if that is the arrangement you are proposing, then I will need the name of the nearest town with a respectable boarding house, because I will not spend one night under the roof of a man who sees me as a compromise." The silence that followed was long enough that she could hear the wind pushing against the window glass and the distant low of cattle somewhere out beyond the yard. Aaron Carson looked at her, and something shifted in his expression, something she could not quite name, and then he said, "Broken Creek. 12 miles south." And that, Bessie would tell herself later, was the moment everything truly began. She had not always been this brave. That was the honest truth. 6 months earlier, Bessie Wells had been sitting at the kitchen table of her older brother's farmhouse in Hannibal, Missouri, reading the same 3-line advertisement for the 4th time while her sister-in-law, Patricia, rattled pots on the stove and made pointed remarks about the cost of feeding a household that included a woman with no husband and no particular prospects. Bessie was 24 years old. She was not plain, but she was not the kind of pretty that men in Hannibal pursued with any dedication. She was too direct, her mother had once told her. Too much opinion in those gray eyes and too little softness in the way she held her shoulders. Men in Hannibal wanted women who bent. The advertisement had come from a placement agency operating out of San Francisco, which placed women in the Western Territories as domestic partners and working companions to ranchers and settlers. The language was careful and respectable. It emphasized compatibility, mutual benefit, and the civilizing influence of women on the frontier. What it meant in plain terms was that a man who could not easily find a wife through ordinary means was willing to pay the cost of transportation and offer room, board, and a legal arrangement to a woman willing to make the journey west. Bessie had written back. She had filled out the forms the agency sent, answered the questions about her domestic skills, her health, her religious affiliation, and her attitude toward physical labor. She had been honest. She could cook adequately but not superbly. She could sew well enough. She had grown up on a farm and understood the work, though she was not experienced with cattle specifically. She had included a photograph that her brother Eli had taken on his portable camera, and she had written one sentence at the bottom of her application that she suspected set her apart from the other candidates. "I am not a meek woman, but I am a good one." The agency had matched her with a man named, and here was where the story took its first dark turn, not Aaron Carson, but a farmer in Kansas named Edmund Whitley. She had corresponded with Edmund Whitley for 6 weeks. He had seemed steady, if not exciting. She had begun to imagine a future. And then, 3 weeks before her departure date, The agency had sent her a letter. Mr. Whitley had, it seemed, reconciled with a former neighbor's widow. He no longer required the agency's services. The agency apologized for the inconvenience. However, they noted, there was another arrangement available if she was still interested in relocating. A rancher in Carson County, Nevada, by the name of Aaron Carson, had specifically requested a woman with some farming background and a practical disposition. His previous correspondence partner, a Miss Clara Finch from Ohio, had unfortunately withdrawn from the arrangement without notice just 2 weeks before her scheduled departure. The season was urgent. Mr. Carson was willing to cover all travel expenses immediately. Bessie had spent 48 hours turning the decision over in her mind. She had not written to Aaron Carson. She had not corresponded with him at all. She would arrive as a stranger to a stranger, without the cushion of those careful, gradually warm letters that were supposed to ease the strangeness of the arrangement. And yet, when she weighed the alternative, another year in Eli's farmhouse, another year of Patricia's pointed silences, and the shrinking sensation of a life not yet lived, she had written back to the agency and said yes. The train journey from Hannibal to Carson County had taken 4 days. She had sat with her back straight and her carpetbag on her lap and watched Missouri become Kansas, become Colorado, become Nevada, the landscape stripping itself of trees and softness as it went, becoming something raw and enormous and indifferent to human feeling. She had arrived at the small rail stop nearest to the Carson Ranch on a Tuesday morning in April 1882, and a lean, quiet man had been waiting with a wagon, not Aaron Carson himself. She would learn later, but his ranch hand, a Mexican-American man named Felix Reyes, who had tipped his hat to her and carried her trunk without being asked, and said almost nothing for the 12 miles to the ranch. The ranch itself had surprised her. She had expected something ramshackle and defeated, the way lonely men's places often were, but the Carson Ranch was well kept. The main house was modest 2 stories, painted white at some point in the recent past, and the outbuildings were solid. There were horses in the paddock, good ones, and the pastures beyond ran with cattle as far as she could see. It was not a rich man's spread, but it was a serious man's spread. A man who worked hard and cared about what he was building. She had walked into the kitchen with her carpetbag, and she had met Aaron Carson, and he had called her the better bargain. Now, standing in the cooling evening with that phrase still burning in her ears, Bessie Wells made a decision. She would not go to Broken Creek. Not because the alternative was appealing, it was not, but because the word bargain had settled into her like a splinter, and she was not the kind of woman to walk away from a splinter. She was the kind who dug it out. "I will stay," she said, "but I want to establish something clearly before I unpack my bag." Aaron Carson, who had been turning toward the door with the air of a man who considered the conversation concluded, turned back slowly. "I am not Clara Finch," Bessie said. "I cannot be Clara Finch, and I do not intend to try. I do not know what she promised you or what expectations your correspondence built. What I can tell you is what I am. I am Bessie Wells. I am 24 years old. I grew up on a farm. I work hard. I am not easily frightened, and I am not easily managed." She paused. "If those qualities are useful to you, then I propose we try. If they are not, then Broken Creek it is." Aaron Carson stood very still for a moment. In the failing light coming through the kitchen window, she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the set of his jaw, the particular tension of a man who had learned to be careful with what he showed. He was, she estimated, somewhere around 30. Maybe a year or 2 beyond. He had the hands of a working rancher and the posture of a man who carried most of his weight alone. "You can have the room at the top of the stairs," he said finally. "Supper is at 6. Felix eats with us." It was not warmth. It was not an apology, but it was a beginning. The next morning, Bessie rose before dawn. She had not slept well. The room was clean but unfamiliar, and the wind made sounds in the eaves that Missouri had never prepared her for. But she was not willing to be found in her bed when the household was already moving. She dressed quickly in the dark, found the kitchen by memory, and had coffee on and biscuits in the cast-iron Dutch oven before the sky outside had turned more than a faint gray pink at the edges. Felix Reyes appeared first, ducking through the back door with his hat in his hands, and stopped when he smelled the coffee. He looked at Bessie with something between surprise and relief and said, "Good morning, Miss Wells." "Good morning," she said. "Sit down." He sat. Aaron Carson appeared 10 minutes later, dressed for the day, and stopped in the kitchen doorway the same way Felix had stopped, though his expression was harder to read. He looked at the biscuits on the table, then at Bessie, then at Felix, who was already eating with obvious contentment. "You didn't have to do this," Aaron said. "I know," Bessie said. She poured him coffee without asking whether he wanted it and set it in front of his usual chair, which she had identified by the wear on the wood. "Sit down, Mr. Carson." He sat. It was the first morning. There would be many others, and each one would build something slowly, the way stone walls are built, one careful layer at a time, but neither of them knew that yet. What they knew in those first days was the bare geography of a shared life. Who rose earliest, who preferred silence at breakfast, where things were kept, what the land required. The Carson Ranch ran about 400 head of cattle across 2,000 acres of Nevada rangeland. It was April, which meant branding season was approaching, and the grass was still good from winter rains. Aaron had two other hands besides Felix's brothers named Tom and Will Decker, young and cheerful, and as alike as matched boots, who appeared each morning at 6 and disappeared at sundown, riding out to handle the fencing and the herd. The work was constant and physical and left everyone tired by evening. Bessie learned the rhythm of it fast. She handled the house and the cooking, which was a reasonable division of labor and she had not expected otherwise, but she also began, carefully and without announcing her intentions, to take on other tasks. She found the kitchen garden behind the house, which had been badly neglected, and began clearing it out. She repaired a section of the fence around the chicken coop where a board had rotted through. She learned which of the horses needed particular handling from watching Felix in the paddock, and she took to going out each afternoon to brush down the two working mares, a task that had apparently been falling through the cracks. Aaron noticed. She could tell by the way he watched her sometimes, that same measuring expression from the first day, recalibrating something he had already calculated. What he did not do in those first weeks was talk to her. Not really. He said what was necessary, practical things, useful things, information about the land and the work and the schedule, but nothing that crossed into personal territory. He did not ask about Missouri. He did not ask about her family or her past or why she had answered a mail-order advertisement. He held himself at a careful distance, and Bessie, who recognized the shape of a wound even when it was not visible, decided not to push. She asked Felix instead. It was on an afternoon in the second week when they were both in the paddock and Felix was showing her how to check the shoes on the roan gelding that Aaron used for the longer rides that Bessie said, "What happened to the woman before me?" Felix did not look up from the horse's foot. "Before Clara Finch, there was a woman named Nora, Aaron's wife." Bessie absorbed this carefully. "He was married." "Was. She died 3 years ago. Fever. She was a good woman, patient, strong. She and Aaron built this ranch together almost from nothing." Felix set the foot down and straightened. "When she died, he closed himself up like a house in winter. He didn't look for anyone new for 2 years. The Clara Finch arrangement was the first time he tried." He paused, running his hand along the gelding's flank. "When she pulled out without a word, I think it landed on a bruise that was already there." "The betrayal," Bessie said quietly. Felix glanced at her. "That's the word for it, yes." She thought about that evening, standing at the kitchen window with the dishes done and the house quiet, watching Aaron cross the yard below in the blue dusk light, moving with that contained, purposeful stride that she had already come to recognize. She thought about a man who had loved a woman and built something with her and then watched her disappear, and who had then tried, carefully and against his instincts, to open a door to someone new, and had been let down without explanation. She thought about what it meant to carry that and still go on building. Still keep the fences tight and the cattle counted and the coffee on at dawn. She did not feel sorry for him in the soft way that softens people. She felt something harder and more respectful than that. The branding started in the 3rd week, and it was the kind of work that left no room for awkwardness or distance, because there was simply too much to do. Tom and Will Decker ran the cattle into the holding pen while Felix worked the fire, and Aaron did the branding with a practiced efficiency that was both brutal and careful. He was never rougher with the animals than was necessary, which she noticed, and added to the slow-growing ledger she kept in her mind about who he was. Bessie handled the tally, counting and recording each animal as it went through, which put her at Aaron's elbow for most of 3 days. On the 2nd day of branding, a young heifer panicked and broke through the holding pen railing, scattering boards and bolting across the yard straight toward the house. Bessie was standing in its path with her tally book, and without thinking she moved not out of the way, but toward the animal, spreading her arms wide the way she had seen her father do on the farm in Missouri, making herself large, turning the heifer sideways before it could build real speed. It veered, circled, and Tom Decker caught it with a rope 20 seconds later. Everyone stopped. Aaron was looking at her from across the yard with an expression she had not seen on him before. She could not quite name it. "You know cattle," he said. "My father raised them," she said. "Not this many, but enough." He nodded slowly. He did not say anything else. But that afternoon he showed her where he kept the secondary tally ledger, the one with the 3-year breeding records, and walked her through the system he used, explaining it with a patience he had not shown before, as though he were admitting her into a room that had previously been closed. It was, she thought later, the most intimate conversation they had yet had, and it was entirely about cattle. That night after supper, Felix had made a pot of beans that was better than anything Bessie had yet produced, and she had told him so without embarrassment. Aaron stayed at the kitchen table longer than usual. Felix had gone to his bunkhouse. Tom and Will had long since ridden home to their own small place a mile down the road. The lamp was burning low, and the fire in the stove had settled to embers, and the kitchen was warm and quiet in the way that evenings sometimes are when the day's work is fully done. "You said your father raised cattle," Aaron said, without looking up from the cup he was holding. "In Missouri," Bessie said. She was mending a shirt at the other end of the table because there was always something to mend. "He had a small farm mixed, mostly grain, but he kept some beef cattle. He died when I was 18, my mother 2 years before that." "You went to your brother after?" "Yes." She did not elaborate. She suspected he understood the rest of it, the arranged domestic service, the narrowed option, the polite suffocation of a life dependent on someone else's tolerance, because he was a perceptive man even in his silence. "Why did you answer the advertisement?" he asked. "The agency said you had been matched with someone else first." She looked up from the mending. "Edmund Whitley. He reconsidered his situation when his neighbor's widow came available." She said it plainly, without self-pity. "The agency offered me this arrangement as an alternative. But you didn't write to me first. You didn't know anything about me." "No," she agreed. "That didn't worry you." She thought about it honestly. "It worried me considerably," she said. "But the alternative was another year in my brother's kitchen being tolerated, and I decided that an unknown future was preferable to a known one that was slowly making me invisible." She paused. "Was that foolish?" He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said at last. "I think that was honest." She looked back down at her mending. "What about you?" she said after a moment. "What about me?" "You had been married. You built this ranch with someone. Why go through the agency at all? There must be women in Broken Creek, women in Carson City." The pause this time was longer. "There are," he said carefully. "But they all knew Nora. They all had expectations, ideas about what I was, what I should be moving toward. The agency felt cleaner, someone who didn't carry any previous picture of me." Bessie considered this. It made a particular kind of sense that she recognized, because it was a loneliness she understood herself, the loneliness of being seen only in terms of the space you occupied in someone else's story. "I understand that," she said quietly. He looked at her then directly, and the lamplight was in his eyes, and she saw something there that was careful and genuine and just beginning to be unguarded, and her heart did something inconvenient and entirely outside her control. She looked back down at the mending. May came in warm and fast, and with it a stretch of days so good, clear skies, steady grass, the cattle putting on weight, that even Aaron's careful composure loosened slightly at the edges. He had a dry, spare humor that emerged occasionally when he was tired enough to stop guarding it, and Bessie began to notice the particular set of his mouth when he was suppressing a smile, and learned to say things that coaxed it out, because it changed his whole face, and she was helpless against the way it made her feel. They had been at the ranch 5 weeks when Aaron rode into Broken Creek for supplies and asked her, with the studied casualness of a man who had rehearsed the question, whether she would like to come along. It was the first time he had invited her into the wider world, and she said yes without hesitating, because she had been wanting to see the town, and because she understood what the invitation meant, even if he was not ready to say it plainly. Broken Creek in 1882 was a small cattle town that had seen better years and knew it. Main Street ran 4 blocks, with a general store, a post office, a livery stable, a doctor's office, a schoolhouse, 2 saloons, and a hotel that also served as the best restaurant in the county, which was not saying much. The people on the street watched Aaron and Bessie arrive in the wagon with the frank curiosity that small western towns reserved for new developments in the lives of their known members. A woman named Mrs. Hartley, who ran the dry goods section of the general store, materialized within approximately 90 seconds of their arrival and established, with the efficient precision of a woman who had managed the social information of a small community for 20 years, that Bessie was the woman staying at the Carson ranch, that she was from Missouri, and that she seemed, in Mrs. Hartley's estimation, like a sensible person. She said this last thing directly to Bessie, with a meaningful glance at Aaron, which Bessie chose to interpret as a compliment to her, and a commentary on Aaron's previous romantic history that was none of her business. While Aaron was at the feed merchant's, Mrs. Hartley guided Bessie through the store and talked, and Bessie listened and learned that Aaron was well regarded in the county, that the ranch was considered one of the tighter operations in the area, that the late Nora Carson had been beloved, and her death 3 years prior had been a genuine grief to the community, and that Clara Finch's failure to arrive had been noted with some satisfaction by the town's small population of opinion holders, who had apparently not liked the sound of her letters. "She wrote to him like a business arrangement," Mrs. Hartley said with finality, as though this settled the matter of Clara Finch's character entirely. "It is a business arrangement," Bessie said, because she was honest. Mrs. Hartley looked at her with the expression of a woman who has found a splinter in an otherwise smooth plank. "Is it?" she said. They returned from Broken Creek with a wagon bed full of supplies and a silence between them that was different from the early silences, warmer, more companionable, as though the outing had moved them slightly further into a shared territory that neither of them had formally acknowledged. That evening, while Bessie was putting away the supplies, she found that Aaron had bought her something, a small packet of flower seeds, prairie blazing star and columbine, wrapped in brown paper and tucked among the flour and coffee. There was no note. She stood in the kitchen holding the packet for a long moment, and then she set it on the windowsill where she would see it in the morning, and felt something large and important move in the general vicinity of her chest. He did not mention the seeds. She did not mention the seeds, but 2 days later she planted them in the kitchen garden she had been clearing, in a row along the south-facing wall where they would get the most light. It was the 2nd week of June when the situation with Aaron's neighbor came to a head and showed Bessie something about Aaron that shifted the last of her caution into something else entirely. The neighbor was a man named Dale Pryor, who ran the adjacent range to the northeast, and who had a long-running dispute with Aaron over water rights to a creek that ran along the property boundary. The dispute was not new. Felix said it had been simmering for 2 years, but it had taken on an uglier quality recently, with Pryor's men cutting Aaron's fence in 2 places and driving a portion of the Carson herd a mile north before Felix and Tom caught up with them. Pryor himself rode up to the Carson house on a Thursday morning while Aaron was out at the far pasture, and he found Bessie alone in the yard, and he was not a man who felt constrained by the presence of a woman when he had something to say. He was broad and heavy, with small eyes that moved around the yard taking stock, and he told Bessie to inform Aaron Carson that the creek water was Pryor Range water and had always been Pryor Range water, and that if the Carson cattle didn't stay on their own side of the line, there would be consequences that the Carson ranch would not care for. Bessie listened to all of this with her hands in her apron pockets. When Pryor finished, she said, "I will let Mr. Carson know you came by, and I will also let you know that this property is recorded with the county assessor's office, and the water rights to that creek are divided equally at the property line by the original land grant documentation, which Mr. Carson has copies of and which any judge in Carson City would be happy to review. If your fence cutting and cattle moving continue, I expect that is the direction this will go." Pryor stared at her. "Who in the hell are you?" "I am Bessie Wells," she said pleasantly. "I live here." He rode off. She went back inside and wrote down every word of the exchange in the household journal she had started keeping, because she believed that documentation was the beginning of most solutions, and then she went back to the bread she had been making. When Aaron came in at noon and she told him what had happened, he sat down at the table slowly and looked at her with that expression she still could not fully name and said, "You told him about the land grant records?" "I did. You do have copies?" "I do." A pause. "How did you know that?" "Felix mentioned the water dispute in passing 2 weeks ago. And I looked at the land documents in the office when I was cleaning. I hope that isn't an imposition. I read them because I was curious." She paused. "The water rights are clear. He has no real legal claim." "I know that," Aaron said. "But Pryor is the kind of man who makes trouble because he can, not because he's right. I've been trying to avoid a confrontation." "I think a confrontation may be unavoidable," Bessie said. "The question is whether it happens in the yard or in a courthouse." He looked at her for another moment. "The courthouse," he said, "is the better option." "I think so too." Within 10 days, Aaron had ridden to Carson City and filed the formal water rights complaint with the county, a step that Felix told Bessie privately he had been urging Aaron to take for 18 months. The complaint was filed. Pryor received official notice from the county assessor, and while the matter would take months to resolve fully, the active harassment of the Carson ranch stopped almost immediately. The fence stayed intact. The cattle stayed put. Felix, meeting Bessie in the paddock one evening, said, "You did that." "Aaron filed the papers," Bessie said. Felix just looked at her and smiled, which was, she had learned, his version of a long speech. She found Aaron at the paddock fence that evening after supper, watching the horses in the last light, and she stood beside him without saying anything because there were times when words were not the thing that was needed. After a while he said, "I've been running this place as though it were only mine to carry." She glanced at him. "It is yours." "Maybe," he said. But he stopped, and she heard him making a decision about something, working something out, and she waited. "You've been here less than 2 months," he said, "and you've done more for this ranch than I managed in the past year, including things I'd been too stubborn or too dug in to see clearly." The honesty in it struck her. "I see it from the outside," she said. "That's not a skill, it's just a position." "No," he said quietly, "it's more than that. You see it because you care about it." She looked out at the paddock, at the horses moving in the soft light, and she said, "I do. I don't know when that happened, but I do." Another silence, comfortable now in the way that silences had gradually become between them. "Bessie," he said. "Yes." He turned to look at her. In the evening light his face was open in a way she had never seen it, the careful distance entirely gone, and she felt her heart do that inconvenient thing again, stronger this time, undeniable. "I said something to you the first day that was unkind," he said. "I've been carrying it." "The better bargain," she said. "Yes, it was a thoughtless thing to say. It was an honest thing to say," she said. "You meant it as an observation, not an insult. I understood that even then. I was angry, but I understood." "It was still unkind," he said, with the firmness of a man who would not let himself off a hook simply because the line had been loosened. "You had come a long way, on faith, and I received you like a delivery." She laughed, genuinely, helplessly, because the image was exact. "You did," she said. "You did receive me exactly like a delivery. Checked me over and decided I was acceptable." He looked pained. "Bessie, I'm not angry anymore," she said. I thought about Broken Creek for approximately 3 minutes, but then I decided you were worth the trouble of staying." "And was I?" She looked at him. He was looking back with that careful openness, and the last of her own guarding softened. "Yes," she said, "you were." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so gentle it seemed to surprise even him, and her breath caught, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because there was nothing that needed to be said that could not be said better by the simple fact of them standing there together in the evening light with the horses moving quietly behind them. The first time he kissed her was 3 days later, and it happened because of a thunderstorm. Nevada thunderstorms in June could arrive with very little warning and a great deal of intention, and this one had been building all afternoon in the southern sky without either of them paying sufficient attention. They had ridden out together after lunch. Aaron had started taking her with him on the shorter afternoon rides, teaching her the patterns of the land and the behavior of the herd, and she had proved an apt and enthusiastic student. And they were a mile from the house when the sky turned the color of old pewter, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. They pushed the horses back at a near gallop, the first fat drops hitting like thrown pennies, and made it to the barn just as the sky opened properly. The horses were inside and skittish with the thunder, and they spent several minutes settling them and getting them into their stalls. And then the rain was coming sideways through the barn door, and there was no going anywhere for a while. The barn was dry and warm and full of the smell of hay and horses and rain-wet earth, and they were both slightly breathless from the ride. And the storm was making the kind of noise outside that makes everything inside feel very close and very immediate. And Bessie was wringing water from the end of her braid and trying to catch her breath, and she looked up and found Aaron watching her with an expression that was no longer careful at all. She did not look away. He crossed the 3 feet of space between them and kissed her, and it was not a tentative kiss. It had the weight of everything that had been building for 2 months, careful and then not careful, distant and then not distant, and she kissed him back with equal directness because she was not a meek woman and she had never wanted to be. When they stepped back, the storm was still roaring outside and she was laughing slightly. Not at him, she would explain, but at the fact that she had traveled almost 2,000 miles to fall in love with a man who had introduced himself by calling her a bargain, and there was something in that was deeply, delightfully absurd. He was smiling, that full, unguarded smile that she had been coaxing out for weeks, and it was as good as she had thought it would be, maybe better. "I should tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "I wrote to the agency last week." She waited. "I told them the arrangement was satisfactory and that no additional correspondence was needed on their end." He paused. "I also told them that the word arrangement was not quite accurate anymore." She tilted her head. "And what did you tell them was accurate?" "I told them," he said, with the care of a man choosing words that he meant to stand behind indefinitely, "that Miss Wells had made this place something different than it was before she arrived, and that I hoped she intended to stay." The rain was drumming on the barn roof, and the horses were settled now, shifting quietly in their stalls, and Bessie Wells stood in the warm, dry center of that storm and looked at Aaron Carson and said, "I intend to stay, Aaron." It was the first time she had used his first name. He heard it, she could tell something in his face acknowledged it, accepted it, settled around it. They stood for a moment longer, listening to the rain. "Good," he said. They were married in August. The wedding was not elaborate. Bessie had not come west in search of elaboration, but it was genuine and it was witnessed, which was what mattered. The ceremony was held in the Carson ranch yard on a Saturday morning when the summer heat was still manageable, and the light was the particular gold that Nevada produced in August, which was not a subtle light but a generous one, thick and warm and entirely indifferent to whether the humans beneath it were happy or not, though in this case they were. Mrs. Hartley from Broken Creek came, and the minister from the Broken Creek Methodist Church, and Felix Reyes stood up as Aaron's witness, and the Decker brothers, Tom and Will, stood in the yard in their clean shirts looking festive and slightly amazed, as though they had expected this outcome but were still pleasantly surprised by it actually arriving. Bessie's only regret was that Eli could not come from Missouri on such short notice, but she had written to him 3 weeks prior and his letter back, which arrived 2 days before the wedding, which was timing that felt like a gift, was warm and surprised, and not entirely unpleased, which was the most she had expected from Eli, who was a practical man, and had always managed his emotions with the same brisk efficiency he applied to his accounts. Aaron stood at the front of the yard in a clean dark suit that she had not seen before, and that fit him as though it had been made to fit him, and he watched her walk toward him across the dry grass with an expression that she had learned by now was the maximum of what Aaron Carson's face was capable of, which was a great deal more than it appeared on the surface. She was wearing a blue dress that she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Broken Creek in secret, and her hair was up, and Felix had given her a small bunch of wildflowers from somewhere on the property that she suspected he had ridden some distance to find. When she reached Aaron, he took her hand. His hand was large and rough and warm and entirely steady, and she held onto it. The minister asked the questions and they answered them, and when it was done, Aaron kissed her again with the same unhurried directness as the first time in the barn, and Mrs. Hartley made a sound that was partly applause and partly something more complicated, and Felix's smile was the widest Bessie had ever seen it, and Tom Decker said something to Will Decker that made both of them laugh, and the Nevada morning was bright and loud and alive around them. They stayed married. That was, Bessie would reflect much later, the simple summary of what happened next. They stayed married and they worked and they built, and the building was not always easy and the work was never finished, but they were good at it together in ways that surprised them both. By September, the water rights dispute with Pryor was formally resolved by the county, and the creek boundary was surveyed and marked, and Pryor, who turned out to be a man who only pushed where pushing was not resisted, left them alone after that, and eventually sold his operation the following spring and moved to California, which everyone agreed was the right outcome for everyone involved. By October, Bessie had the kitchen garden producing abundantly enough that she was putting up vegetables for the winter, and had experimented with a cold frame Felix had helped her build along the south wall, trying to extend the growing season into November. The prairie blazing star she had planted in May came up in late summer and turned a section of the south wall brilliant purple, and Aaron had stopped one afternoon while passing and looked at it for a long moment and then looked at her, and she had felt in that look the particular quality of a man who had not expected beauty to reassemble itself in his life and was still slightly surprised each time it did. The first winter was hard. Nevada winters were not Missouri winters, and she had to recalibrate everything she knew about cold, about keeping a house, about the particular bleakness that descended when the days were very short and the land was very white and the nearest town was 12 miles on a bad road. Aaron was attentive to the change in her. He had learned to read her moods with the same quiet care he applied to the land, noticing before she did when she was low, and he responded in the ways available to him. He built up the fire without being asked. He brought her a novel from Broken Creek without announcing it was for her. He taught her cribbage in the evenings, and she beat him so consistently within 3 weeks that he accused her of previously undisclosed card-playing experience, which was not true, but was funny enough that they both laughed until the cold outside seemed further away. Felix celebrated Christmas with them and brought a bottle of wine he had been keeping, which was a remarkable thing to produce in the middle of the Nevada desert, and he explained with great modesty that he had been carrying it from his sister's house in Sacramento for 8 months because he had been waiting for an occasion worthy of it. Bessie declared herself very moved by this, which was true, and Aaron said that Felix had a talent for ceremony that the rest of the ranch entirely lacked, which was also true. On a cold evening in January, Bessie told Aaron that she was expecting. He was very still for a moment. Then he said her name, just her name, and she heard everything in it, the old grief that had made him careful and the new joy that had made him less so, the weight of what had been lost and the astonishment of what was here. And she went to him, and they held on to each other in the fire-lit kitchen for a long time, not needing to say anything more. She told him later, much later, in the warm dark of their bedroom with the winter wind outside doing its worst and the quilt heavy and warm over them, that she had been afraid to tell him, not because she doubted him, but because she understood what the prospect carried for a man who had already had this particular happiness and had it taken. "I was afraid," she said, "that you might be afraid." "I am afraid," he said honestly into her hair, "but I'm more glad than afraid." She thought about that. "That seems like a good ratio," she said. He laughed, low and warm, and pulled her closer, and the winter went on outside. The spring of 1883 came late and wet and cold, which was good for the grass and hard on everyone's patience. Felix delivered a calf in the middle of a mud-soaked night in March, while Aaron was down with a fever that had lasted 3 days. And Bessie ran the ranch that week with Felix's guidance, managing the accounts and the work schedules and the morning check of the herd. And when Aaron emerged from the bedroom on the 4th day, pale but upright, he found the operation continuing without interruption and looked at Bessie across the kitchen with something that she was not too modest to identify as pride. "I should get a fever more often," he said. "You should not," she said firmly, and made him sit down and eat, and he sat and ate and watched her move around the kitchen, and she felt his eyes on her with a warmth that had become, over the past year, as familiar and necessary as the light. By May, when she was large and slow and thoroughly irritated by both conditions, Aaron had finished building an addition to the back of the house, a room that had started as a practical necessity for the coming baby but had grown, under the encouragement of Bessie's specifications, into something that was also a proper nursery, with a south-facing window and the walls painted a warm cream. He had done most of the carpentry himself, with Felix assisting on the heavy framing, and the result was not perfect, but it was solid and careful and built with the same quality of attention that Aaron brought to everything he valued. Bessie ran her hands along the windowsill the first time she saw it finished and said, "It's good work." "The corner joint on the south wall is a little rough," Aaron said. "The corner joint on the south wall is fine," she said. "It is good work, Aaron." He looked at her with that open, unguarded expression that still, more than a year after she had first found it, did something to her equilibrium that she had no complaint about. Their son was born on the 14th of June, 1883, on a hot, bright morning that did not seem to be aware of the gravity of what was occurring inside the Carson farmhouse, being entirely occupied with shining on the sage and making the horses stand drowsy in the paddock. The birth was handled by a woman from Broken Creek named Mrs. Alvarez, who was the nearest thing the county had to a midwife, and who was efficient and calm, and spoke soothingly to Bessie in both English and Spanish throughout, which Bessie appreciated more than she expected to. Aaron was not permitted in the room, and spent the waiting hours on the back porch in a state of visible controlled anxiety that Felix managed by handing him coffee at regular intervals, and talking about the upcoming cattle drive, which neither of them was thinking about. The baby arrived healthy and loudly announced himself, and Mrs. Alvarez brought him out to Aaron, and Aaron took his son with both hands and a carefulness that made Felix have to look away, because it was too private a thing to watch directly. When Bessie was settled and Aaron came in and sat beside her on the bed and showed her the baby, she looked at the small red face and the dark hair and said, "He looks like you, does he?" Aaron looked at the baby, then at her, then back at the baby. "I don't think I look like that." "Give yourself some time," she said, and he laughed, and the baby, disturbed by the sound, opened his eyes briefly and closed them again with the decisive air of someone who had not yet determined whether the world was worth the trouble. They named him James, for Aaron's father, who had died before the ranch was built. James William Carson, William for Bessie's father, who had raised her on that Missouri farm and given her the practical education that had, more than she could easily say, prepared her for this life. James was a good baby, serious, observant, slow to smile but constant once he did, which Bessie identified immediately as a trait directly inherited from his father. Aaron held him in the evenings after supper with a steadiness that was not new to him, but was new in its context, and Bessie would watch them. Her husband with his careful hands and his guarded face that was not guarded at all in those moments, and her son who watched the world with dark, skeptical eyes, and feel the particular quality of happiness that lives in the present tense, not reached for or held onto, but simply inhabited. Felix, when James was 3 weeks old, made the drive to Carson City and came back with a small wooden toy horse that he had carved and painted himself, which he gave to James with great ceremony, and not a word about the work it had taken. Bessie kissed Felix on the cheek, which embarrassed him magnificently, and the horse lived on the nursery windowsill for years. The summer of 1883 was good. The cattle drive in July went well. Aaron came home 3 weeks later dusty, and tired and lighter in spirit than she had seen him in months, the particular energy of a successful season in his face. And the year's account came in stronger than the previous two, which meant that the note on the south pasture land that Aaron had bought 2 years before could be paid off, which he did with visible relief, and a satisfaction that went beyond the money into something about self-sufficiency and standing free of obligation that she understood was important to him in a way that went back before she arrived. There was a hard period in the fall when she received a letter from Eli saying that their brother's farm was in difficulty, bad harvest, some debt that had accumulated, and she sat with the letter for 2 days before she showed it to Aaron, because she did not want to ask him for something and she had not yet fully unlearned the habit of carrying things alone. When she did show him, he read it once and said, "What does he need?" And she realized again with something like wonder that she had chosen well. They sent what they could, which was not everything Eli needed but was enough to keep the farm from the worst of it, and in February of 1884, a letter arrived from Missouri saying the situation had stabilized, and Eli was grateful and intended to visit in the summer if Aaron was willing to receive him, which Aaron confirmed by return letter with a directness that made Bessie suspect the two men would get along, as both of them dealt in practicalities and neither of them wasted words. Eli came in July with his wife Patricia, who was, and Bessie could acknowledge this now, at a safe distance and with a generous spirit. Not a bad woman, but a woman shaped by scarcity into a smallness that had chafed against Bessie's particular kind of largeness. Patricia arrived at the Carson ranch and looked at the house and the land and the person Bessie had become within it, and something shifted between them, some old tension releasing, because what had been competition in Eli's kitchen was something different here. Here, Bessie was not a burden to be managed. Here, she was the woman of a place, and it showed in everything about her. Patricia said on the second day, "You seem very well, Bessie." "I am well," Bessie said, and meant it without complication. Eli took to Aaron immediately, as Bessie had predicted. They spent 3 days riding the range together and talking about cattle and land values and the water situation in the county and the difference between Missouri farming and Nevada ranching. And when Eli left, he shook Aaron's hand for a long time and said, "You have a good place here." "I have a good woman," Aaron said. Eli looked at Bessie. "You always did have more sense than I gave you credit for," he said, which was, from Eli, an apology and a tribute all in one. She hugged him and he hugged her back, both of them a little stiff about it because they were not naturally demonstrative people, and Patricia hugged her too, more easily than she expected, and the wagon drove away down the dry road and Bessie stood watching it go with the feeling of something settled and completed. "Are you all right?" Aaron said from behind her. She turned. He was standing with James on his hip. James, who was 13 months old and had recently discovered that walking was possible, and was taking every opportunity to demonstrate this at inconvenient moments, and he was watching her with that quiet attention that she had learned was love, was what love looked like in him, steady and observant and ever-present. "I am entirely all right," she said, and went back to them. The years that followed built themselves in layers, the way the land built itself, one season over the previous season's work. The ranch grew not dramatically, not the way fortunes grew in the mining camps or the railroad towns, but solidly, acre by careful acre, head by head, the kind of growth that lasts because it is earned. By 1886, Aaron had added another 200 acres to the north and taken on a third full-time hand, a quiet and competent young man named Henry Abbott from a ranch outside Reno, who worked hard and caused no trouble and became, over time, as much a part of the operation as Felix and the Decker brothers. James grew into a boy who combined Bessie's directness with Aaron's quiet deliberateness in a way that was occasionally exhausting and consistently delightful. He was outdoors from the earliest possible age, following Aaron on his morning rounds with the solemn concentration of an apprentice, asking questions that Aaron answered with the same care he brought to everything. He learned to ride at 4, which Bessie considered slightly early and Aaron considered appropriately early, and this was one of the very few areas in which they ever genuinely disagreed, which they argued about with the comfortable confidence of people who know their disagreement will not damage anything important. In 1885, Bessie discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Aaron immediately, without the fear she had felt before, and he received it with the open happiness of a man who had learned that joy did not require defensive qualification. The second baby was a girl, born in March of 1886, after a winter that had been long and gray, and in which the news of her coming had served as a particular light. They named her Rose for no one in particular, simply because the name was what it was, and she was what she was, small and fair and fiercely opinionated from her first days, which Felix declared to be entirely Bessie and Aaron declared to be an extraordinary coincidence. Felix was, by this point, as much family as anything else. He had turned down 3 separate opportunities to take higher-paying work elsewhere over the years, and when Aaron had asked him once, directly, why he stayed, Felix had said, "Because this is a good place and good people are worth staying for." And Aaron had not pushed the subject because he understood that some things did not need to be analyzed, only acknowledged. Mrs. Hartley from Broken Creek visited occasionally and brought news and opinions in equal measure, and she watched the Carson household with the satisfaction of a woman who had correctly identified something good in its earliest stages. She told Bessie once, during a visit when James was running in the yard and Rose was being held by Felix, and Aaron was visible through the window at the kitchen table, that Broken Creek had taken a general view that the Carson situation had turned out unusually well. "That is high praise from Broken Creek," Bessie said. "It is the highest," Mrs. Hartley confirmed. There was a difficulty in 1887 that came from an unexpected direction. A man named Colton arrived in the county that spring, a cattle buyer from back east with money and ambition, and no particular attachment to the methods by which he achieved his aims. And he was buying up range land at prices that seemed good, until you understood that the purpose was consolidation, that the small ranches and farms he was absorbing were disappearing into a large operation that would ultimately control the county's water and grazing access in ways that would make independent ranching impossible. Aaron had seen this before, Felix said, had watched it happen in parts of Texas and New Mexico, and he understood what it meant for places like the Carson Ranch. Colton came to see Aaron with a formal offer in June, riding up in a very good buggy with a legal man beside him and a price that was, on paper, generous. Aaron listened to the offer without interrupting. Then he said, "No." Colton appeared unsurprised. He said that ranchers often needed time to consider and that the offer would remain open. Aaron said the offer was no longer necessary. After Colton left, Aaron came inside and stood in the kitchen, and Bessie looked at him. "Did you need to think about it?" she said. "No," he said. "Neither did I," she said. "They were not the only ranch that refused." In the months that followed, Aaron became one of several ranchers who organized what they called a county alliance, no formal charter, just a regular meeting of landowners who communicated about Colton's movements and methods and coordinated their resistance. Bessie attended these meetings, which were held at various ranches on a rotating basis, and she was the only woman present at most of them, which she noted without making it a point of dispute. She was there to be useful, and she was useful, particularly on the question of the county records and land grants, which she had developed a particular facility with over the years. In the end, Colton's operation ran into difficulties from multiple directions: a legal challenge in the courts, a particular water rights ruling that went against him, and the simple fact that enough people had refused to sell that the consolidation could not reach the critical mass he needed. By 1888, he had withdrawn from the county and directed his capital elsewhere. The alliance celebrated quietly, the way working people celebrate, which is to say they acknowledged the outcome and went back to work. Aaron told Bessie, after the last alliance meeting, that she was the reason the documentation had held together. She said the documentation had been there all along, and she had only organized it. He said that was exactly what he meant, and she let him be right about it. Rose, at 3, was a creature of strong convictions and tremendous energy who had to be watched constantly in the vicinity of anything she had expressed interest in, which was everything. She and James had the relationship of siblings who genuinely liked each other, but expressed this primarily through argument, which Bessie considered healthy, and which Aaron regarded with the expression of a man who had not quite accounted for this particular dimension of family life. Felix found Rose absolutely wonderful, and she found him equally wonderful, and they had a private alliance that consisted largely of Felix appearing at strategic moments with small treats from his saddlebag, and Rose rewarding him with the complete and undivided adoration that she was very selective about distributing. The ranch, by 1889, was producing consistently well. The cattle herd had grown to 600 head, and Aaron had made 2 strategic decisions: one to improve the breeding stock, which had cost money but was paying back steadily, and one to formalize a supply arrangement with a meat buyer in Carson City that gave them reliable pricing and reduced the uncertainty of the annual drive. These decisions had been made, as all of their major decisions were made, in conversation at the kitchen table in the evenings after the children were in bed, which was where the real business of the Carson Ranch was conducted, not in the fields or the pastures, but in the warm lamplit kitchen over coffee, and the particular quality of a shared life that has grown into something larger and more genuine than either person had originally imagined possible. On a September evening in 1889, 7 years after Bessie Wells had stepped off a wagon with her carpetbag in hand and been told she was the better bargain, she was sitting on the back porch in the warm late-day air, watching Aaron ride in from the north pasture on the roan gelding, not the original roan, who had long since retired to a comfortable old age in the paddock. But his son, same color, same steady temperament, and James, who was now 6, ran to meet him at the paddock gate the way he always did, and Rose, who was 3, sat in Bessie's lap with her head under Bessie's chin and her small solid weight against Bessie's chest. And the Nevada evening was doing its remarkable thing. With the light turning everything gold and long and patient, and Bessie thought about the word bargain. It was not the word she would use. She could not imagine the word that would contain what she had, the accumulated weight and warmth of 7 years in this place, this work, this family. The way Aaron still watched her across a room with the same attention he had always had, but now with the depth that time added to knowing her fully, knowing the worst of her impatience and the best of her courage and the complicated middle ground where most of her life actually lived. The way he still made her laugh, dry and spare, and almost always at a moment she did not expect it. The way he reached for her hand when they were walking somewhere together without seeming to notice he was doing it. The way a man reaches for something that has become as natural to him as breathing. She thought about who she had been in Eli's kitchen in Missouri, that woman who had been making herself small to fit into a space that was not made for her, and she felt the distance between that woman and this one like a physical space, vast and irrevocable. Rose stirred against her and said in the sleepy, proprietary voice of a 3-year-old, "Where is Papa going?" "He's putting the horse away," Bessie said. "He'll be here." And he always was. He put the horse away and came across the yard in the evening light and came up the porch steps and looked at the two of them, Rose half asleep and Bessie watching him, and sat down on the top step and leaned back against the post and let out the long breath of a day's work finished. James came thundering up the steps behind him and threw himself down with the physical abandon of a 6-year-old, and said something about the heifer in the south pasture that had been giving them trouble, repeating exactly what Aaron had told him with the authority of a junior advisor to a significant enterprise. And Aaron listened with absolute seriousness and agreed that yes, they would check on her in the morning. Bessie said nothing. She just sat in the warm evening with her daughter in her lap and her son explaining cattle management to her husband, and the light going slowly down over the Nevada hills, and felt the fullness of it, the ordinary, extraordinary fullness of a life that had been built from a bargain. The irony of that word had never fully left her. She had turned it over many times in the 7 years since Aaron had said it in that kitchen on her first day, examining it the way you examine a stone that catches your eye, not beautiful exactly, but particular, with something in its grain. He had meant it as a transaction, a better deal than expected. A replacement who was, it turned out, an improvement on the original arrangement. He had said it without thinking, the way people say things that become true in ways they did not intend. Because here was what Bessie Wells had come to understand about the word bargain. A bargain, by definition, is something of more value than its cost. And what she had built here, what they had built together, what had grown out of a mail-order arrangement and a train ticket from Missouri, and a man who had received her like a delivery and a woman who had refused to go to Broken Creek. This was the better bargain in the only sense that mattered. The evening deepened. The cattle were settled. The horses were in. The house behind them was warm and lit and full of the smell of supper. Aaron looked over his shoulder at her. "James thinks the south pasture heifer needs watching overnight," he said, with the particular neutrality of a man reporting information he has already assessed. "James is right," she said. James looked between them with an expression of vindicated authority. Aaron smiled at her, that full, unguarded smile. "I'll check on her at 10, he said. "I'll have coffee ready," she said. They were quiet after that, the family together on the porch in the falling Nevada evening, and somewhere beyond the hills the sky was going purple and bronze, and the land was enormous and indifferent and entirely theirs. And Bessie Wells, who had crossed 2,000 miles on faith and arrived as a replacement for a woman who never came, who had been called a bargain by a man who had not known yet what he was saying, Bessie Wells, who was now Bessie Carson and had been for 7 years, simply sat in the last of the light with everything she had ever actually wanted and let it be what it was. James fell asleep on the porch step, leaning against Aaron's leg at some point before the stars came out, and Aaron carried him inside with the careful hands that were a large part of who he was, and Bessie carried Rose, and they put the children to bed in the warm rooms of the house they had built together. And the night settled in over the Carson ranch, quiet and enormous and entirely at peace. Later, much later, in 1891, a third child came, a boy they named Daniel, for no particular reason except that the name suited him, arriving with a full head of dark hair and an appetite that suggested he intended to make the most of his situation. James, who was 8, declared himself an expert on babies based on previous experience with Rose, which Rose, who was 5 and did not consider herself to have been anyone's educational experience, disputed with characteristic precision. Felix held Daniel at 2 days old and was again completely undone in the best possible way, and Aaron watched his family around the kitchen table and felt the particular thing that he had stopped trying to name some years before, having determined that it was larger than whatever word he had available for it. Bessie, recovering from the birth in the warm September light of their bedroom, with Daniel in the crook of her arm, and the sound of her children and her husband and Felix moving in the house below her, thought about a letter she had sent to the placement agency in San Francisco some years prior, not in response to any inquiry, but simply because she had felt like it. She had told them that the arrangement had turned out well. She had thanked them for their part in it. She had said, somewhat cryptically, that she hoped the story of the replacement who turned out to be the better bargain might be useful to them in some way, perhaps as evidence that the arrangements they facilitated could produce something more than arrangement. They had written back politely, saying that they were very glad to hear it. She had not needed them to understand what she meant. She understood it herself, which was enough. What she understood was this: a woman can be sent as a replacement for someone else and still arrive as herself. A man can receive a stranger and discover, over the careful geography of shared work and shared seasons, that the stranger has become the most known person in his world. A ranch can become a home. A bargain can become a life. And a life, if you are willing to build it honestly, without flinching from the work or the cost or the ordinary daily difficulty of being fully present with another person. A life can become exactly what you needed it to be, even if you did not know at the beginning what that was. Bessie Carson knew. She had known for some time. She had known it in the kitchen on cold mornings and in the paddock in the summer light, and in the evenings on the back porch when the land went long and golden, and her family moved around her like the pieces of something that had found its proper shape. She had known it in the quiet moments of the night when Aaron was warm and sleeping beside her, and the house was completely still. She had known it in the difficulty and the work and the love that was not soft but was real, and was steady, and was hers. James grew tall and became, as he had always intended, a rancher to the bone. Aaron's instincts and Bessie's directness made into a person, and everyone who met him said so. Rose grew into a young woman of formidable intelligence who also, it became apparent by her 12th year, had a gift for plants and growing things that Bessie recognized as her own in a different form, and who spent her adolescent afternoons in the kitchen garden that Bessie had built up over the years, until it was a productive and elaborate thing that bore almost no resemblance to the weedy, neglected patch she had found on her first April morning at the ranch. Daniel was quieter than either of his siblings, thoughtful and steady in the way that youngest children sometimes are, with Aaron's careful hands and Bessie's gray eyes and a temperament that was simply his own, original, fully himself. Felix stayed. Of course he stayed. He was there the morning of Aaron and Bessie's 10th anniversary in August 1892, when Aaron pulled out of somewhere a bottle of wine, decent wine, which was not easily obtained in Carson County, and the family sat on the porch in the evening and drank it, all of them who were old enough, which was everyone except Daniel, who was compensated with a very good piece of pie that Mrs. Hartley had sent over with a note congratulating the family with characteristic efficiency. Aaron looked at Bessie across the table in the porch lamplight and said, 10 years. 10 years, she agreed. Do you remember what you told me the first day? He said. You said you were not easily frightened and not easily managed. That is still accurate, she said. It is, he agreed, with the satisfaction of a man confirming a long-standing truth. I want you to know that neither of those qualities has ever been a problem for me. She looked at him. The light was warm and his face was the same face she had been learning for 10 years, more familiar to her now than her own, and she felt the long, quiet, extraordinary weight of the life they had built pressing gently against her chest from the inside. Good, she said, because I have no intention of changing them. He reached across the table and took her hand, as he had done 10,000 times in 10 years with the same ease as breathing. I know, he said. That's why it works. Felix raised his glass and said something in Spanish that Bessie understood well enough by now to recognize as a toast to the things that last. And James, who was 9, raised his cup of milk with great ceremony. And Rose, who was 6, raised hers with even greater ceremony because she was Rose. And Daniel sat in Bessie's lap and regarded the proceedings with the grave approval of a 1-year-old who has not yet decided what he thinks about wine, but is supportive of the general atmosphere. The Nevada night was vast and full of stars, and entirely at peace around them. And that was where the story lived, not in the drama of the arrival, or the confrontation in the kitchen on that first day, or even the particular turning points of difficulty and resolution that every life contains. But here, in this ordinary evening, this ordinary family, this place that had been built from a replacement and a bargain and 2 people who had the extraordinary good sense to stay. Bessie Wells, who had come west on a train in April 1882 as a substitute for a woman who had never appeared, who had been told on her arrival that she was the better bargain, had turned the bargain into everything, had turned the replacement into an original, had turned the transaction into a life that was irreplaceable, completely her own, and completely full. And in the morning, as she had every morning for 10 years, she would rise before dawn and put the coffee on, and the light would come up over the Nevada hills, and the horses would stand drowsy in the paddock, and the land would be vast and present in theirs. And Aaron Carson would come down the stairs with his hair still uncombed, and take the cup she held out to him and sit in his chair and look at her across the kitchen table, and she would look back, and it would be enough. It would be, as it had always been, the better bargain.